Morning everyone. Hope you're able to see the screen as well as you're able to hear me. All right, great. So let's continue with the topics. This is where we were. We just looked into different constraints on which we may have to deliver the operating system. So we basically looked at what are all the different types of machine architectures that will be there, the single processor, multiple cores, and so on. As well as we looked into a couple of variations of the operating system, the older one wherein the processor is going to shift from one process to another when there is a break for an IO operation and so on, and the other type is going to be doing it, giving a fair share for everyone. A single second is going to be shared for every process that is there in queue, so that everybody gets a feel that the processor is doing only their job. So that was the two variations that we had over there. Now moving forward, what are all the different data structures and computing environments that we need to be familiar with, so that the OS can be developed in a much efficient way. So as far as these data structures are concerned, some of these things are going to be repetition of the things that you have studied in the data structure course. So primarily we'll go look into a couple of these data structures. The first one is an array. You already know that it's a, sequential arrangement wherein I can just refer to the array content directly by looking at that particular index. Something like I have an array of 100 elements, then I can straight away refer to something like array of 50 to get the 50th element over there and so on. Okay, so the advantage of this is it's very simple to implement. There is nothing complex. So we can assume something like a main memory can be constructed with the help of an simple array over there.
Penning ma? Pen.
Any doubts there? Okay, but the disadvantage of this particular arrays is how do we, try to delete a particular thing from this particular array. Suppose, certain thing need to be taken out from the main memory, then that space need to be allocated to something else, and they come with different size and so on. So not a very great way of implementation over there. A slightly advanced version of that is basically a list which is used in many of these data structure applications, and even in case of operating system you can find an extensive use of this particular data structure over there. There are of course different types of list, that is singly linked list, doubly linked list, circularly linked list, and so on. So look at this particular diagram. This basically illustrates a singly linked list. So there are basically going to be two part in every node of singly linked list. One part consists of the data, and the second part consists about where is the next data that's going to be present over there. So the address of the next node is going to be stored in the second part of that particular node. So like this, yeah, the nodes are going to be arranged. So, but when you follow this particular arrow, you will come to know that they are all connected to each other in a one direction. That's why it is called a singly linked list over there. Advantage here is, variable size things can be easily deployed using this particular thing. Insertion, deletion, searching is fairly straightforward in such kind of data structures over there. But on the other hand, if we have both directional arrows, then it is called as a doubly linked list as indicated in this particular diagram. You see that now along with the data you have a one arrow which is taking you to the next node, as well as the next node will also have a connection back to the previous one as well as to the next one. So it's basically bidirectional. So everything knows what is preceding it and what is following it. All the nodes are aware of this particular information. So the other variation is going to be a circular linked list. Only changes the last node is going to have the address of the first node. Apart from that, it is very similar to a singly linked list over there. So the last one loops back to the first one. So you can imagine this basically like a circle of nodes, and hence it is called as circular linked list over there. As indicated earlier, advantages, it can accommodate items of varying size. If something like having a 40 KB data, so node size can be 40 over there, and if something is say 150 KB, another node could be of that particular size. Unlike array, this is more flexible in case of implementation over there. And insertion and deletion is not a problem in case of list, whereas in case of array, you need either shift up or shift down all the content, which is going to be very tedious job, but list makes it very, very easy over there. So the performance of such performance is basically a worst case turns out to be O of n. You have to visit all n nodes in order to find something in a linear search over there. So that's basically considered to be pretty bad over there. Irrespective of these things, the list, especially the singly linked list, is used in couple of kernel algorithms, and they are also used in order to implement stacks and queues, which are heavily used in case of operating system over there. So the next type of data structure we're going to discuss is going to be stacks and queues. Stacks are basically based on LIFO principle. That's basically last in, first out. What it means is, the items are going to be stored on top of each other, and but when I'm removing, the topmost is going to be removed over there. So that's going to be the arrangement over there. Okay, so just run through this particular slide for a minute. I'll be okay. Sorry for the interruption there. So stacks are basically based on the LIFO principle, and operating system often uses these stacks when involving a function call. I'm executing say a function one, and then the function one invokes, let us say, another function called as function two. Then basically what happens is the content of all the registers, cache, memory, all these things need to be dumped somewhere. So for that purpose we will basically use the stack in case of operating system. The register contents the instruction where it need to come back, all these informations are basically stored in stack first, and then the control shift to function 2. It will start executing the function 2 by loading all these datas into registers and so on. It will complete all that job and come back and pop the topmost element of stack, which basically tells where the control need to come back and then restore the contents of the registers. Okay, that's how we basically use the stack in order to implement the function calls in case of operating systems. We will look into more details when we comes for process scheduling topic over there, but this is basically the gist of it. On the other hand, queues are working on the principle of FIFO, that is first in, first out. So they are basically organized next to each other. whoever reported first is going to be taken into consideration first, and then is going to be served, and the next one is going to be picked up, and so on. So generally all these processes are basically scheduled using the queues in case of operating system, as well as the printing jobs. You might have seen whenever you start giving a print command on multiple documents in a particular desktop, there is going to be a queue that is being formulated. The first document which you gave for printing is going to be given a preference first. Once that printing job for that first document is going to be taken out, then the second document which you try to print is going to be picked up, and so on. So basically all those printing jobs are, formed in the form of a queue over there, and accordingly they are going to be printed. So this is basically working on a FIFO principle over there. Another data structure that is popularly used in case of operating system is what is called as trees over there. Tree basically has got a root node, and a root node can have any number of childrens, and each children can further become a parent, and it can create some more number of childrens, and so on. That's the general concept of trees over there. The variation, there are a couple of variation of trees. One of that is going to be a binary tree, wherein every parent is going to have only two children, and further we can have binary search tree wherein the left node is always lesser than or equal to the right node. So an additional constraint that can be put into this particular binary tree to make it as binary search tree. There are another variation of it called as balanced binary search trees. One such example is the red black trees. I think I believe that you have studied that particular thing in the course of data structures, which is typically used in Linux operating system in order to perform a CPU scheduling algorithms, right? So I don't know, are you familiar with red black trees over there? Have you studied that particular data structure? Anyone? Oh, you have not studied? Right, right. Okay, fine. It's a pretty simple concept basically. Okay, so B trace and AVL is what you have studied, right? So red black trace are very simple one. You can just Google it. Wiki itself will give you enough information about it. Balance trees you are familiar with. Okay, good. Right. Let us proceed further. After these trees, there are something called as hash function and hash maps. Basically, hashing is the one that we need to focus over here. So, what happens in this particular case is every input is basically, fed as an input to something called as a hash function, which will give you an answer over there, and based on that particular answer, we can try to speeden up the process of searching for an item over there. All right. For example, let us say, in your class there are 60 students, and I want to, look at some SRN of a student whose name is, say, Abhijit, or a student whose name, say, Lavanya, or a student whose name is, say, Sachin, right? So what is the easiest way in which I should organize this data so that I can, just go and pick up their SRNs over there? So one such thing, technique that we try to do is a hash function. A simple hash function in this particular case is arrange them in the alphabetic order. So let us say hash function will have a value between A to Z, because those are the possible first character of every name over there. So I have a hash function starting with A, I have a hash function with starting with B, starting with C, and so on up to starting with Z, right? Now say I want to know the SRN of Abhijit. So under the hash function A, I will have an associated say entries which will say Abhijit SRN, say whatever is his SRN. Let us say there is another person called Amala whose name also starts with A, then the same hash function will have one more entry for Amala, and then it will also have the SRNs of Amala. Let us say there was one more student called Amok. So next to Amala there is going to be one more entry called Amok, and along with that his SRN and so on. So basically, whenever somebody asks me to get the SRN of Abhijit, all that I need to do is I look at the hash function. Hash function will quickly tell me that go and search in hash function value A. That means my search space is greatly limited over here. I just need to look at the tray associated with starting letter being A, and whoever it is, I'm going to easily quickly retrieve the SRN over there. On a similar hand for Sachin, there will be hash function being yes. Yes will have an associated node which says Sachin, so and so SRN. And somebody asked me to retrieve the SRN of Sachin. I just look at this yes and travel it here. I'll find Sachin and I'll retrieve and give the SRN over there. So this is the advantage of hash functions, but care should be taken that you need to produce a right kind of hash function over there. On the other hand, if your hash function is wrong, then it might give you a lot of collisions over there. So more than one function, when you try to process it for a input, you get the same answer over there. So that could be a problem. See, this hash function is up to you to decide what is the best thing. So in this particular case, I looked at the starting letter of the first carrier, for starting letter of the name as the hash function, so that I don't have much confusions over there. On the other hand, let us say that I would have thought about the string length as a hash function over there. The name string length, if I have taken, then what is the problem? Say Amog, AMOGH is going to have 5 character. So string length being 5 will get you Amog. Sachin, SACHIN, okay, that's 6. Amala, AMALA, so that's again going to be 5. So there are too many entries which will end up in 5. There could be an imbalance. So string length being 1 and 2 is going to be very most likely 0, and 3 and 4 and 5 is going to be heavily loaded. In such cases, there is too many collisions that will happen, which will result in inefficient way of searching over there. So a careful fixing of a hash function is mandatory when you are trying to implement these particular hash functions and maps over there, right? And the last one is basically called as bitmap. Suppose I indicate everything we using n number of bits, then sometimes it is very easy because it takes less amount of memory and try to give you more information. For example, let us say I have 4 printers present available with my system over there, and I want to indicate their status over there. So what I can do is I can just dedicate one single bit representing the status of every printer over there. So since I have 4 printer, I just require 4 bits over there. And the convention that I can follow is I represent the bit as 0 in order to indicate that that particular printer is free, and I can use the number 1 to indicate that it is basically busy, or it is a convention for you. You could have gone with the reverse as well, but do it consistently over there. So what I assumed is 0 means it is free and 1 means it is available. So now in order to represent the status of all 4, I just require only 4 bit. Something like, I represent the entire thing as 1111, which basically says that printer 1 is occupied, printer 2 is also occupied, printer 3 is also occupied, and printer 4 is also occupied over there. Or I could have even have something like 1001, which basically says that printer 1 is occupied, Printer 2 status is 0, that means it is free. Printer 3 status is 0, which means it is free. And printer 4 status is 1, which says it is occupied over there. So this is going to be a most efficient way of representing information, but doesn't suit for all the requirement. Only when I have only two possible values, this makes sense to do that. But this is quite used quite a bit in case of OS in order to indicate the availability of a particular kind of resource over there. So this is another important data structure that you need to be familiar with. So just to recap, what are all the different data types that we have seen? The first one, we started with arrays. Second, we modified the concept of arrays to call it as list, and there are types of lists, that is singly linked list, doubly linked list, and circular linked list. And using this list, we can implement what are called as stacks and queues, which are heavily used in the operating system. So that's the next type that we have seen. And a modification of those concepts to suit our requirement is basically trees, and there are balanced binary trees that is important to us. And then we looked into hash function, and lastly the bitmaps over there. So these are the different types of data structure that we need to be familiar with in order to study this particular course. As and when we proceed further to discuss some of these implementation, OS implementation algorithms, we will be referring to these data structures. So at that particular point, you should not get a question, oh, what is bitmap? I don't remember, and so on. So that's the reason why this particular topic is covered here. If you have any concerns, doubts till this particular point, you can ask me now. Any issues, doubts? Bitmap slide again. Okay. Yeah, this is the bitmap slide. Let me know what is that you did not understood in this. Basically, a toggle bit. Suppose a printer is free, then you represent it with 0. The moment I give a print command to that particular printer, the bit is getting set to 1, indicating it is occupied with some printing job. And after some time, when the printer becomes free, once again it will toggle back to 0, indicating it is free. That's the simple concept. Right, since we are talking in terms of bit, a say 8 printers can be represented using just 1 byte, 1 bit for every printer over there. 8 printers can be easily handled with 1 bytes of data. So that's the advantage. So it is very space efficient, as well as retrieval is going to be very simple in this particular case. Verify. Okay, right. What do you mean by can we switch the bit reference? What is mean by switching of bit reference? I did not understood bit reference part of it. Yeah, that is your convention. That's what I told. No, in this example, I assumed it like this, but you can always make your own assumption. It has to be consistent throughout. That's the only requirement. So everywhere you need to refer it in the same way. So you can toggle that meaning of that particular bits, and accordingly you have to write the code. Right, let us proceed further. The second part of it, this is about the data structures which will be used in the kernel, and second is the environment wherein the operating system is basically going to be used. So let us start with the traditional environment wherein a standalone system is used as a general purpose computers. So basically these were the ones which used to access internet and perform some kind of normal day-to-day activity, and in some cases these systems are basically connected using a local area wired networks so that they can share the data with each other, and they also have a connection to an internet with the help of a firewall which is basically going to protect and monitor what is going out and what is coming into this particular network over there, right? So this is our very traditional computing model. So the one which we had seen from say 1980s till today. So in some points we can see this kind of traditional computing model, so wherein systems are used in this particular way. Now, but the technology is changing a lot. So the second type of computing environment is using mobiles. Right? So I'm sure many of you would have been using a smartphone and tablet to access this particular lecture classes throughout the day. So earlier in say 1980s, we couldn't have even imagined somebody taking class using computers. But even if I assume that certain videos were available, people would have used a computer to view such videos over there. So in fact computers were such a lavish thing in say early 2000 as well. I remember my engineering days, entering a computer lab is most like a prestigious thing. Okay, you're doing a bachelor's in computer, so you are given a chance to touch computer and work with that. You write a program over there. It was like a very prestigious thing to the students as well as to the parents. But today you can imagine the cost of computers have gone down so much, and it has occupied our day-to-day life so much that computer is mostly an integral part of it. In every home we will find at least one computer, and in many cases it is mostly one computer per head, and there are cases wherein people working with more than one computers as well, right? So that's how the things have changed, and we are so much dependent. So more advanced version of that is using mobiles and tablets to do whatever job you used to do with computers over there. Many of you check your emails using mobiles only. Many of you attend your classes using mobiles only. Many of you read your lecture notes or say ebook and so on using your mobiles and laptop tablets only. So it is trying to replace this particular job of the computer, that you can do it with the help of mobiles and tablets over there. So the basic advantage of this mobile computing is it is very handy to carry, and you can walk around with lots of data and access to lots of data with the help of mobiles, and it has some extra features like GPS, gyroscope and so on. Nowadays you also get this augmented reality and so on. So there is no LAN connection to these mobiles. It is all wireless connections. You can just connect it to uh, a modem through an wireless mode and get connected to the internet and so on. That's how this mobile computing environment look like. There are limitations with this. First, battery is limited in case of mobile. So whatever OS that you are going to run in case of mobiles has to be very efficient one in terms of battery usage. Limited amount of battery is available. Nobody would like to have a mobile which has which has a battery backup say for an hour. So people want the mobiles which can last at least a day. That's a minimum requirement. More than a day is what is preferred over there. So Wherever you are writing a OS for a mobile applications, or whenever you are trying to write a application for mobile, battery is the one thing that you need to consider. Secondly, computation power is limited. You cannot compare the performance of a mobile with a high-end laptop over there. RAMs are limited, processor speed is limited, external storage is limited. So these are some of the limitations in the mobile computing environment with which we have to be familiar with. In spite of that, there are two variations of the OSs that is popularly used. One is the Apple iOS and the other one is Google Android. There are different flavors of it. I hope you are familiar with those things. The third one is basically a distributed environment wherein computers are connected with each other using a communication network. Optionally, there could be a server present also there, and for the end user, it is going to act like everything looks the same as one single computer over there. But basically, tasks are getting distributed with multiple systems over there. So these networks could be local area, wide area, or the storage area network, and so on. But it right require a network operating systems in order to handle the communication between these peer computers which are connected with each other. So this is about distributed computing. We'll see a variation of that in the coming slide. The next one is a client server computing. Most of these interfaces are found in the early applications from 2000 and onwards. So there is a powerful server which is present over there, which will does the bulk of the job over there, and multiple clients are going to be connected to this particular server over a network or the internet as well. So clients are going to do only a small part of the code process. That is, they only raise a particular request that will reach the server via this particular network, and server is the one which is going to execute that request and generate a response, and it is going to send it through back this particular network to the client system. So the client is going to be mostly lightweight processes, and the server need to be more powerful in this particular case over there. Right? So one of the thing that you have experienced is your CBT environment. I know it's been quite some time you wrote your CBTs, but the system is built based on the client server model itself. So you sit in front of a system and take up a exam or a quiz and so on. So all that is done is your system, wherever you are writing the exam, is connected to a server through the local area network. So all that you are trying to do in your client, maybe you are taking a particular option, or you are typing an answer for a descriptive question and so on, is basically transferred as a request to this particular server. In server, it goes and stores in a specific database, and the server generates an acknowledgement for that. Yes, I have received it, and that's communicate back to the client machine. And in the client, you get a message something like answer is stored, or some kind of success message. You get it in case of clients over your system, or where you are taking the exam over there. So this is basically the client server architecture that you have seen there. Now, peer-to-peer is basically a variation of a distributed model that we spoke over here. So in this particular slide, we talked about distributed environment. A variation of that is basically a peer-to-peer computing model. So what happens is, there is no leader over here. All these multiple computers are interconnected with each other through again a network over there, and there are variations in this peer-to-peer. So in some cases, in some cases there is a centrally managed table which says which computer is doing what job. Let us say there are 5 specific tasks that need to be done. Your client 1 might be doing job 1, client 2 is expert in doing job 2, client 3 is doing job 3, client 4 is doing job 4, and client 5 is expert in doing job 5. So whenever any of these particular computer want a particular job to be done, they basically communicate to the specific one. Let us say this client 3 wants a job 5 to be done. who is expert in doing job 5, which is client 5. So all that it does is it will consult this centralized table who is expert in doing job 5. It will come to know that it is client 5. So this client 3 will send a request to client 5 in order to do that particular job. So client 5 will do that job and sends back the response to client 3. So this is how peer to peer friends are basically connected and doing a particular job. Some example, real life example is you have a group of people, who are friends and always do a combined study. Let us say Amir is good at maths, so he'll always teach maths to all his peers. Let us say Asha is good at Python, she teaches Python and programming and everything. Let us say Joseph is basically good at operating system, so he teaches OS and so on. So this is basically nothing but a peer to peer. You don't go and ask Asha about OS, or you don't go and ask Joseph about the maths over there. So basically, you go to an expert of that particular subject and take the information from him. So that's exactly what is done in peer-to-peer communication over there, computing environment. There is a variation of it. You don't require the centralized table in many of the peer-to-peer communication. So all that you try to do is everybody broadcast what they wanted. Suppose client 3 wants as job 5. So all that it can do is it will just inform that I need to do a job 5. It will send that information to client 4. At the same time, it will send it to client 5. At the same time, it will send it to client 1. At the same time, it will end to send it to client 2 as well. Now each of them will see what kind of job it is. Client 1 see, oh, this is job 5. Not I'm not an expert. Ignore. Client 2 will see, oh, I am also not an expert in doing job 5. Ignore. Client 4 will also see, this will also ignore that particular request. But when it comes to client 5, it says that, yeah, this is my domain. I need to solve it, and it will reply back to this particular client 3 who made a request saying that, yes, boss, I am an expert in this particular task. You give me what is it, I will execute and give you the result. So that is another model. Then you don't require a centralized database to find out who is expert in doing what. So it is basically client who requires a service will broadcast his requirement, and whoever is expert in that will respond it back with their answers over there. Something like, I don't know operating system, I just put a group message in my WhatsApp group, dude, I want to know this particular concept of OS, who is ready to teach me. Now Joseph is an expert in the operating system, he'll say that, yeah, come to me, I'll teach you this particular concept. So that kind of model is basically the variation that we have spoke about, is what is called as peer-to-peer answers over there. There are some famous applications which were built on this. Snapstar and Gnutella were the very classic example which works on this peer-to-peer. And in fact, Skype is the latest addition to it, which works on the same principle over there. Now, virtualization is another important concept to know, which is strictly not as per your syllabus, but it is good to know kind of thing. So basically what happens is I have a machine which is running Windows here, and I want to show you some kind of execution of on Linux. So I have two options. One is I run a emulator program over there. So I download a Linux emulator and type in that particular command under an emulator, which is extremely slow in execution, but because it doesn't directly connect it to the hardware through the Linux interface over there. All that it will try to do is it will take the command, translate it in equivalent thing, the way in which Windows is basically handling it, then executing it and getting back with the result over there. So this is one way of handling which is very inefficient, doesn't work all the time. The second one is having a virtualization. So you run multiple OSs on a particular OS over there, is basically virtualization. Say I am having a Windows OS in this particular thing, which is basically my host OS, and I want to execute Linux on top of this particular Windows simultaneously when it is on. That's basically the Linux is going to be my guest OS, and the simultaneous execution is happening with the help of what is called as virtualization. Now, why is this particular thing is even required? So whenever I develop a particular application, I need to have a compatibility across multiple OS in order to, target multiple clients, types of clients over there. So what my software need to work on Windows, my software need to work on Linux, my software need to work on Ubuntu, my software want to work on Mac OS, and so on. So I don't have to have a system having all these OSs separately. Rather, I use virtualization. In one system I execute all these things, and the same code can be tested on multiple OSs, and we can be sure that the cross OS compatibility is basically assured over there. So all this virtualization will have a central concept called as VMM, Virtual Machine Manager, which is basically taking care of running these particular codes in their native interface over there. So this is a simple block diagram which basically says what happens if you try to run it on a single system. So you have a process, it will run through the kernel of the OS, which will coordinate with hardware and get you the result. So this is what happens if I have one single OS without any virtualization. When I have a virtualization, what will happen is there is a hardware on top of that is virtual machine manager is going to sit, which will handle different virtual machines. So one virtual machine might target about the Windows OS, another virtual machine will target about the Linux OS, and the other virtual machine might target for Mac OS. So virtual machine manager is a crux here, which is going to handle requests from different OSs and translate everything into a native interface and execute in the hardware and get back to these corresponding results over there. So this is the base concept of virtualization. Now, the cloud computing environment requires this particular virtualization over there. So basically, cloud computing in simple, there are enough of services which are available on the globe. So you use it and pay according to your usage is the concept of cloud over there. So there are different types of cloud. One could be public cloud, wherein the resources are available on the internet. Anybody like you and me want to use it, I just pay and use that particular service. Other one is private cloud, which is exclusively for a company's own use, so they want to have a secure environment over there. A combination of these basically is called as hybrid cloud. And cloud basically offers different types of service. Software as a service, that is SaaS, is one of the thing. I have a proprietary software, so I just install it in couple of server and I accept payment from multiple people. They don't have to purchase the entire software over there. So on an hourly basis, probably I'll charge them and I'll allow them to use my software over there. So that's one thing. Platform as a service is the second one, wherein this software stack is ready for an application. Again, you paid based on this particular services that you are trying to use it. One classic example is the database servers which are available for usage over there. And the third one is infrastructure as a service, maybe a storage. I have huge storage and it is not worth it to buy a storage in order to do that particular backup business. So you hire a cloud space and you store all your data securely over there. So that's basically the third type, infrastructure as a service over there. Now this is an example of how these particular clouds are basically organized. So once again, there are going to be multiple virtual machines running with different servers, and there's going to be a cloud customer interface which is accepting requests from multiple cloud customers, and there's a cloud management service which is going to translate this into different servers over there. That's about cloud computing environment. So basically our OS need to work in different environment. The last one is real-time embedded system, which is used in many of the non-laptop or desktop or mobile computing environment. Could be your automobile vehicle, or could be your oven, or it could be in your TV, or it could be in your washing machine, and so on. But you need to remember that it is working with the limited resources and for a specific purpose. So whatever RTOS that I find in a microwave oven doesn't even work in case of an washing machine over there. So their jobs are extremely specific to what they need to do it, and any deviation, they just stop working over there. It's not like a foolproof system. It is doing a specific job only if that particular condition is basically met over there, right? So we wanted quickly to recollect. We had a traditional environment, then a mobile computing environment, then client server architecture, peer-to-peer architecture, and cloud computing, as well as the last one is real-time embedded system. So these are the different types of the environment wherein we need to work, right? So let us close today's class at this particular point. See you in the next class with more concepts.